Good evening and welcome again to the Eclectic Radical. As always, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical, and with me again is my partner in crime, Alex Suarez. Tonight, a guest I'm very happy to have on the show and who I've wanted to have on several versions of shows and just haven't ever asked before, which is my fault, is Dr. Tamanisha John. Thank you very much for joining us, and please tell our viewers a little bit about yourself.
Yes, so thank you so much for having me. Right now, I'm actually very tired tonight, but I am a professor at Clark Atlanta University. I teach the international political economy courses, development courses, and international relations courses there. And about myself, um, well, I guess that I'm here to talk about imperialisms at home and abroad because in my own work, I write and I study and I research about imperialism in the Caribbean. I study multinational corporations, banking institutions, mining corporations, and just any sort of foreign entities that set up in the region for extraction and exploitative purposes. Um, this is a topic that I would say has interested me for quite a long time, except obviously as I'm older now, I have the words and vocabulary to talk about it. Funnily enough, when I first entered college, even before I read anyone like, Walter Rodney or any of the dependency theorists, my first paper I wrote why the US is invested in underdevelopment in the Caribbean. And I think that I viewed it back then as, we have all of these resources and capabilities that if we really wanted to help people, we can, and we don't. And sort of that has guided my studies throughout my life. And yeah.
And I would say you're right. And if anything, we actively make it harder for other countries to develop. We did everything we could to keep Portugal in Mozambique long after they wanted to leave. We fought a war with Angola. We fought a war in Angola, a proxy war using South Africa eventually when we couldn't do it with any Angolan factions anymore.
You mean the white South African regime? Yeah.
Yeah, we did everything we could to stop the Congo from developing, including killing Patrice Lumumba.
In the 1960s, that's right. I had a question for Dr. John. So a lot of people hear the major international relations and they think strictly diplomacy. Is that true? Or if it's not true, how is it broader than that?
Well, I think that international relations, and this is something that I always stress in my course because I stress why it's important to learn the history of a discipline. But before there was international relations, you had people who were majoring in things like colonial administration. So if you've read Vitalis's book, White World Order, Black Power Politics, you get to see how international relations is born out of people having these titles as colonial administrators, how to effectively manage colonies. And so when we make this switch to thinking about how we foster better state relations or cultural relations with other countries, I think that that's where the diplomacy aspect, the common understanding of diplomacy aspect in international relations come from. However, I think that people should understand that international relations as a field or a discipline is very much entrenched in ensuring that the status quo or the Western capitalist system is kept in order between countries. And so you can call it diplomacy because when people talk about diplomacy, they think about goodwill and all of these positive aspects. But really, when you have the US Secretary of State going to other countries or the US President going to other countries, it's not to just, have nice relations with those places. It's to make sure that they're not bucking any sort of orthodoxy that we benefit from here. And I think that that's very important to make clear that that is what, diplomacy and international relations typically means. And I should also note to people who are on this call that it is quite rare to get an international relations professor like me who will tell you that that's what things are. Most people will say, go and work at the UN, go and work for the State Department and government, and do all of these good things to help people develop or better their relations or help them modernize without questioning what exactly any of that actually means.
So I see the world more and more as a multilateral instead of a unilateral world. And a good example for that is when the United States recently sent an official to visit several sub-Saharan African countries to basically tell them to cease doing business with Russia and China. And it had the opposite effect. The official left Africa, and those countries went out of their way to have meetings with officials from Russia and China to show that they're going to continue to operate in a multilateral world, no longer under the sphere exclusively of the U.S. empire. Dr. John, if you wanted to comment on that, or of course, Chris.
Well, I think that as more countries start to do business with states like, Russia, Iran, or China, or any of these other countries and pull themselves out of, the U.S. capitalist nexus, that's a good thing. It would shift the world to a more multilateral order. However, I think that it's misguided to say that that's happening on such a scale now that, what the U.S. want or U.S. goals and aspirations won't be met. I think that now, and it's true in international relations, it's very sexy to talk about the rise of China and the rise of Russia and the rise of all of these other countries. But as someone who studies imperialism and specifically economic imperialisms, it is still the US and the United Kingdom that dominate global finance. And they dominate in such a sense that, while Russia and China are on the map as distant fifth, sixth, and seventh, given that the Western order encompasses all of Europe, the world economy, its financial systems are still very much enmeshed in the Western capitalist system. And as long as those states that do business with Russia and China have any sort of debt towards international financial institutions like the IMF, the choices that they can make in their business deals and arrangements with China and Russia are severely limited. And so they could do like these little passes and little agreements, but in the grand scheme of things, we are not at a point yet where those types of decisions being made by leaders to buck, sort of the Western capitalist orthodoxy are enough to be meaningful if we want to take a more grander perspective. But it is a step that I encourage and I hope that we do see more of.
So Chris and I sometimes talk about BRICS. What's your opinion of BRICS?
So for people who are watching and who wouldn't know, BRICS are, the rise of countries like Brazil, Russia, India, China, and some people include South Africa as the S. And I will here plug Vijay Prashad's book, The Darker Nations, but there's a difference. And even Alina Sajid's, she recently wrote an article a couple years ago talking about the shift away from the third world project and sort of what is now the global South. And in this global South narrative, which is really just the globalization of capitalism and more people being integrated into that system, you have the rise of BRICS, and unlike the Third World Project, BRICS are not a cohesive bloc. So you have reactionary leaders in Brazil, you have reactionary leaders in India, and so they're not a cohesive bloc against imperialism. They're not calling for any sort of new international economic order. People say that they vote together sometimes, but also China and India, for clear reasons, are antagonistic towards each other. So even though you have the BRICS, again, they are not posing a cohesive challenge to the dominance of the U.S., the Anglo-settler world and the European, Western European system.
Doesn't China itself have a larger economy than the United States now?
It depends on what terms you want to say. Like if we're just talking about in pure numbers, how much people they have and how much capital they can amass, you can look at those superficialities. But when you look at the global financial system as a whole, the U.S. is still, again, the U.S., UK, Western Europe, they still lead and dominate that. And China has a lot of U.S. Debts and currencies in its exchange, which is why also in international relations, the war with China trope is quite stupid. The U.S. would literally financially ruin itself if it did that. But again, that is not enough, given how much debts the U.S. is able to run up against other countries, precisely because it still leads the global financial system. So again,
Yeah,
I think that it's overblown.
I mean, you can talk about China manufacturing everything in the world in a few years, and that's pretty accurate. But the problem, this is to a very great extent what the world wars are about. Before World War One, the UK had undisputed control of the international banking system. They were in charge. They could pretty much say what they wanted, and people had to listen. The reason that Woodrow Wilson entered World War One, in his own words, was to preserve the vision of the kind of international relations that you were talking about, Doctor, where it's really a matter of specific countries taking from other countries for as little as they can possibly pay, if anything, and enriching the elite in those countries in a way that doesn't benefit the general population and certainly doesn't benefit the country as a whole. And World War One was about keeping that system in place. The original idea Wilson had of a soft Versailles Treaty was about keeping that system in place. And it was really ruined by the insistence of the French on punishing Germany and setting the seeds for a future world war down the road, almost no matter what else happened political wise, because Germany was going to go through the same revanche period now that the French had gone through before. And Germany would be spending generations calling for French blood. And the most interesting part of the whole Hitler taking power scenario is still the fact that the day before Hitler was named chancellor, the acting chancellor was conspiring with the president to become dictator on the same terms that Hitler later became dictator. And the president at the last minute decided he didn't want to give an experienced general with lots of military clout that kind of civilian power. It would be easier to control Hitler. And
right,
so
it had to be under an emergency, and that's why they did the Reichstag fire, which was basically a false flag, and then passed the Enabling Act.
Yeah, and that was all to, but I mean, but that was the whole thing, is that there was already an emergency, and what people don't really get is that the previous chancellor von Papen was already an effective dictator. Because the Weimar Constitution meant that if you had a deadlocked Reichstag, the chancellor would present bills, and then the president, if the Reichstag stayed deadlocked, the president would use his emergency powers to pass the bills after the vote didn't get any result.
For those that don't know, the Reichstag was basically the German parliament at that time.
Yeah, or the German House of Representatives, if you prefer.
Right.
But yes, and so the whole first term of Hindenburg, who was the president who made Hitler chancellor, his whole first term was passing bills. All the legislation that was passed using his emergency powers, with Papen putting it in front of him, saying, "We can't vote. What do you think, Mr. President?" And the president would say, "All right, it's stamped." And they'd take it out and say the law was passed. So the primary difference was that Hitler wasn't von Papen. Hitler had a clear idea of what he wanted to do, and it wasn't just passing a few bills to tinker around the edges. He wanted to take over the system and go to war. But we're getting far afield, though this is it is a good example in that we then brought a whole bunch of Nazis to the United States after World War II.
Well, let's look at colonialism, right? Because colonialism is related to imperialism, which is the topic. Hitler sent Rommel to North Africa.
Yes.
Not to liberate them and to expel the British, but to expel the British and take over those areas as colonies.
Yes. The French. Originally, it was the Italians fighting the French, and then the French surrendered, and the Italians were beaten by the British, and so Hitler sent Rommel.
Right.
You want to know that this is actually a good example to just get back to the conversation that we were having before. I just thought of this. But if we want to say that the West enriched itself because it had all of these colonies that it was to exploit, if you are someone who believes that, China is rising up to the event that it would rival that of the United States, then you have to ask yourself, well, does China have colonies? And then the answer to that question would be no, it's entering partnerships with other countries, right? And so that is how or why because China is not able to exploit other countries in the global system in the same way that the Anglo-settler world and Western Europe has been able to, China cannot rival those countries within its own set system that they created. In fact, if the U.S. were to be declining on some narrative, it would select, Canada or Australia or some other Western European country to lead, not, China or Russia.
Exactly. And now, countries, as a good comparison, China has one foreign military base, and that's in Djibouti in Africa. And it's to guard an oil field that is important to both the locals and the Chinese.
I believe the Russians have two foreign bases. One's in Afghanistan. I don't remember the other country.
They have
the United States has over 800.
Their only year-round naval base. Well, their naval base on the Mediterranean is in Syria. That's
right. Syria and Afghanistan are the only two countries that have Russian bases.
The Syrian base in Russia is the reason that Russia was always, to some extent, involved in the internal politics in Syria, and why we were never really going to throw Assad out, no matter how much noise we made about it.
Well, also because Putin was deceived over Libya. And I heard Dr. John is a Pan-Africanist, so she could comment on this, because, of course, Gaddafi was a Pan-Africanist. But Putin believed them.
As a Pan-Africanist, to be clear.
If you don't think he was, feel free to educate us on that as well. I'm just pointing out that.
No, I'm saying that I've never identified myself as that.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought at some point you did. Okay, well, we get into that. But the point I'm trying to make is that Libya, Putin was told that it would be no intervention. And so he abstained from the vote. He didn't use his veto power. He was deceived on that. There was an intervention immediately after that was passed. And so when they tried to do the same with Syria, that's when he changed course. And that's really when he became vilified by the West. And then in part also because he had relations with us. I mean, Russia had relations back from when Assad's father was in power, and there's a base there, but also because he didn't like how he was deceived in the UN. And that's why he strongly came against the intervention.
Are you asking a question, or?
Well, if you wanted to comment on Libya and what happened there, whether or not you're a Pan-Africanist, I'm sure you have an opinion about what happened in Libya and some of the reasons behind the intervention. I heard, for example, one of the reasons was that he was trying to make a golden dinar for the African Union to use as a currency, and that went against the petrodollar. And you know more about economics than me, so I mean, you're free to comment on that.
So I will say that I don't know as much as I would like to on either Syria or Libya, so I wouldn't be able to give like a super informed opinion on the topic. So I've heard the same thing about the African Union having some sort of currency, or Gaddafi trying to have a more unified Africa as being like a potential reason as to why they wanted to oust him out of his leadership. But personally, I've not read or explored that area of the world. And so I don't feel as if I would be the best person to comment on that. Of course, after the intervention in Libya, you had open air slave markets, you have people trying to get into Europe, and refugee crisis, and given the xenophobic and reactionary nature of liberal and conservative governments in Europe, they have not helped that situation at all. And so that's the extent I know about it. It would be a bit vague or somewhat superficial. It's not as if I don't know about it, but I just don't know enough about it to given
to the best of my knowledge, it was about oil and about the petrodollar, but I don't know enough of the specifics to speculate too much. I believe it was about a deal to sell oil to specific parties in the European Union in euros instead of dollars. I could be wrong.
There's probably multiple economic reasons behind it, and the timing of it.
The Venezuela mess. The Venezuela mess came specifically when Hugo Chavez, in order to get a better price for oil, made a deal to sell oil to neighbors, particularly
Argentina,
Bolivia, Argentina, and Ecuador, in their own currencies instead of dollars. Which, of course, the two big deals that maintain the U.S.'s financial supremacy are their control of markets in Europe and their control of resources in, whether you want to call it the third world or the global south, depending on which era's terminology you prefer. It's the control of resources that the U.S. doesn't necessarily own directly, combined with the control of markets in Europe, again, that we don't own directly, that puts the U.S. in the position it is financially and economically. And the U.S. is worried about things slipping away on either the resource end or the market end. The best example of the market end is that Germany canceled a pipeline that had been trying to build for years to get Russian gas at a cheaper price than Norwegian gas. And they killed the pipeline themselves over the Ukraine war. And Norway won't cut the price of gas or oil to its NATO allies, despite the fact that its NATO allies are essentially cutting off their own nose to spite their face with Russia in order to maintain this oil and gas market in Europe that's sort of split between Scandinavia and the U.S.
Well, I wonder why Norway hasn't entered NATO, because Sweden and Finland recently did their first Scandinavian.
Isn't Norway already a member?
I'm not sure about that.
Norway was the one that was.
I thought that Sweden and Finland were the first Scandinavian countries to join NATO.
Denmark was already a member too, I thought.
Okay, I was unaware of Denmark. I know Denmark's in Scandinavia, but I mean, Latvia, for example, is a Baltic state, not a Scandinavian state, and of course, Latvia and Lithuania already joined NATO. But
Norway is a NATO state.
Norway has been in NATO since the founding. That's what I.
Okay, what about Denmark?
Denmark is also a member.
Okay, so the two remaining Scandinavian countries that were not part of NATO up until this year were Sweden and Finland, and they just went over to the other side, right?
Well, Sweden and Finland were both neutral,
right,
in terms of their positioning between the U.S. and Russia during the Cold War. Sweden was officially neutral, but sort of pro-West. And Finland was officially neutral, but sort of pro-USSR.
Well, Finland had a history of hostility with the Russians as well.
They had a hostility of the Russians, but the word Finlandization comes from what happened in Finland after World War II, when they tried to make their government as acceptable to the Russians as possible to avoid being taken over the way other countries that had been occupied by the Germans and liberated by the Russians had been taken over.
Interesting.
But we should get back to closer to home, because part of this is how things come back home. One of the more interesting things I learned from reading is that the New Jersey State Police have a uniform that is based on the German colonial police uniform in German Southwest Africa, now Namibia, during the years when they were practicing for the Holocaust in Africa, basically.
Wow.
And so everything that happens overseas comes back home eventually. All our aid to Israel has come back home in the form of Israel training U.S. cops. If you watch, there was a video for a while
And
of,
Ukrainians were training the alt-right guys at Charlottesville. Americans go abroad, these right-wing groups or police, like you said, and they get trained by terrorist states.
I mean, that's how it works when you're playing these games with. But even closer to home, Haiti. You know, we made Haiti pay reparations to France. The U.S. forced them.
With our Navy, right?
Yes. Well, the
Yep.
previous year we invaded the Marines invaded the country and stole their gold reserves. And then the U.S. and then the Navy occupied the country and stayed there until Haiti paid off their debt to France. But that's what I meant. One of the examples when I was saying that we've actually stopped other countries' development. Okay.
I don't know if it's breaking up for you guys. Is it glitching?
I'm looking good right now, or at least I seem to be. Is it breaking up for you?
No, like sometimes it goes down. But
I can hear and see everything fine.
Yeah, like he just broke up for me.
Well, yeah, no, he just froze. That's him switching.
Now it's breaking up a little bit. Dr.
Yeah,
John, her camera's out right now.
When you switched, we could tell the difference. Yeah.
All I did was charge my phone. I had to do the show from my phone this time.
No, I remember that. Yeah, we can tell.
I will say, though, that when we talk about imperialism, people tend to only focus on like policing forces. And I think that when you only focus on policing forces, it sort of distorts the picture or makes the picture less real for people in terms of how it impacts their everyday lives. So, for instance, like in the US currently, we have gentrification. That it's we have gentrification on a mass scale only because there's investments for landlords and real estate companies and corporations to make in sort of land and living, right? And an example that I always like to give to students in like some of the intro to politics courses when we talk about gentrification and how it impacts us, local, state, and then global level is an example from my real life. But when I was like a teenager around 13, 14, or in that age range, I lived in a neighborhood where, it was homes, but they weren't like houses. It was a house, but there were apartments in the house. So you have like five different families living in a house. So it was like house apartments. I'll call it house apartments. And in our neighborhood, we also had like a factory that sold clothes and did a bunch of other things in it. And I think that the majority of people who worked there were women, but there were some men who were in our neighborhood, our community, who worked there as well. And when I was 13, 14, everyone knew that, like, they paid you bad there. Some people had work accidents where they lost a finger or things like that. But it was just there. We knew that people weren't being paid enough, but also immigrant communities. So, that's just what it was. And I remember when I was around 15, 16, the factory closed and they built like a convenience variety store. And I remember being excited about that because that was like a store in our neighborhood. So you didn't have to go far to go to a store now. And I thought this was like, a good development or whatever. So, as the years go on, and it happened like year after year. Another thing that went away was 2 of the house apartments went away and they built like another store, like dog grooming services and some offices or something like that. And when that happened, I remember thinking like, oh, like, we used to play with the kids who lived in these house apartments and now those house apartments aren't there. So that's the first time that I was like, oh, maybe the development happening here is bad, because where did those people go? And then soon after, of course, we had to move too, because we couldn't afford to live there anymore. And when we moved, it had an even more personal impact, because now it's like, oh, we have to move from a place that we were at for, quite a while. And I always tell my students that story, and I ask them, what happened? And they all say, obviously gentrification happened. You have this nice store that comes in, then you have people who move out, blah, 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 blah. And then I ask them, but, so the dynamics in that neighborhood change. Where do you guys think that initial factory went? Because when the factory goes, then you know that the factory is paying people shitty wages. People lose their limbs and things, toes and everything in the factory. You don't really mourn it in the same way. And also, maybe it's because I was, younger, a teenager, but it didn't occur to me like, wow, all the people who used to work in that factory lost their jobs. That was not even a thought that crossed my mind. It was just, oh, wow, there's this like store here that we have that we didn't have. And I tell people that factory, for our specific situation, we knew that the factory went to Pakistan, right?
Yeah.
And so that factory in our neighborhood that we knew was a shitty factory went to a third world country, or, a poorer country, a more developed, underdeveloped, as they would say, country. And it most likely is paying people there, mostly women, an even shittier wage. And they probably have a lot more labor violations. But because, they've gone abroad, none of that matters anymore. And so the reason why I like to share that examples with students is because I think that it more so clicks in their mind. Because, again, police training comes off as diplomacy, right? You're always giving the other country security aid. And so it doesn't click in people's minds like that. But when you tell them a story about how gentrification has these local, state, and then even global impacts in terms of where that corporation has gone, I think it comes together more clearly for them. You also have people who use the banana example to show how much people get paid down the line, and you see the people doing the heavy labor getting the worst end of the stick. But I really think that when we speak about imperialism, in order to get people to understand it, to understand its consequences, and that it's rooted in exploitation that then comes back to haunt them, they have to first recognize it as something that visibly impacts them when it does, right? And I think that sometimes if we only focus on talking about the military or police, it's something, sexy, where they can go out and protest at one time and it's done. But had we known, for instance, that convenience store was going to be how our community became displaced in the span of 3 years, I think more people would have been upset about it, right?
I think you're right.
Also, there's internal imperialism, such as the for-profit prisons. That's an aspect of internal imperialism, and it is directly related, and I believe we've discussed this on the show before, to the quota system, the quota arrest system that the police implement viciously. That's because for-profit prisons now can sue states for not giving them enough prisoners. Therefore, the governors pass these laws, and they have these quotas, and it's a form of internal imperialism. Go ahead.
They're all for-profit prisons now. It doesn't matter whether it's owned by a private company that's profiting off the state, or whether it's owned by the state and the state is using it for revenue by leasing prisoners to corporations themselves. They are all for-profit prisons now.
Well, what I'm saying is, back when they were just public prisons, they didn't have the right to sue states like they do now. So it's become worse.
Well, and that's definitely part of it. But I mean, California has almost no private prisons, yet we still had an attorney general, now vice president, who said, we can't let nonviolent marijuana offenders go. The state needs their labor.
Exactly. And slavery, of course, is legal in prisons.
Exactly. But I'm glad that Tamanisha mentioned economics, because there are really good examples of how imperialism works in our supermarkets. Bananas are so cheap and plentiful in the United States because the United States has invested a great deal of money and a great deal of both diplomacy and military force into keeping an affordable supply of bananas. Woodrow Wilson was late getting into World War I because he was busy conquering Central America for Chiquita Banana.
Well, Chiquita Banana, which was called United Fruit at the time, the owner was Dulles' brother, who was head of the CIA. The first coup in Latin America by the CIA against Guatemala was after there was an attempt to nationalize United Fruit in the country.
Yes, but remember, even before that, the government of Guatemala was one that had been set up by the United States when its troops pulled out. The
term Banana Republic comes from before Guatemala, right?
Yeah, well, Guatemala was one of the banana republics. The first official one was Panama when
it was separated from Colombia.
It was separated from Colombia so they could build the canal by when Teddy Roosevelt was president. But but imperialism, both in the fact that an American company owned all the banana fields in Central America, and in the military sense that, well, why did they own the banana fields? Because we went to war over bananas. But as a result of that imperialism, every American knows bananas and eats bananas, and bananas are a part of American culture. And it's because of that imperialism.
Well, bananas were brought here from Spanish imperialism. Columbus found them in the Canary Islands before he got here, and they brought the banana seeds there.
Yes.
Interestingly enough, the word banana is actually Arabic in origin. It means toe or finger. But yeah, that they the Spanish imperialists via Columbus had brought the banana seeds. I find that ironic, right? Because you have the bananas, a product of imperialism today, only from the U.S. empire now.
Well, again, it's that whole idea of we want to control so that we can profit.
Listen, this is fascinating, but I'm very tired. Go ahead, Dr. John.
Yeah, and I was going to say that I think that it's this issue of control that people have to really examine.
Yes.
And not just sort of the coercive control that a lot of people get riled up about, but also the sort of non-coercive forms of control, because there are consequences. So while we cheer on and champion, for instance, the Solomon Islands for not allowing the U.S. Ships to dock at their ports, or these deals that other countries sign with China and Russia and other states and countries, these countries also will face consequences from the United States. And I think that while we champion sort of the signing of the deals and we sort of ignore the fact that they will face those consequences when deals fall through or they don't meet our expectations, of course, the mainstream media narrative will, of course, run to the fact like, oh, this country shouldn't have signed this deal with X, without examining the broader consequences of control. And not just control, but the ability to sanction as well. And so right. I think that when we examine these situations and look at deals being made, we should also, again, place a lot more scrutiny on those with the control. And I'm going to argue and I will maintain that the biggest threat to freedom, liberty, and justice in the world today is U.S. imperialism. It's backed, maintained, and sustained by Western European countries and their capital, as well as Anglo-settler countries like New Zealand, Australia, Canada, etc.
World opinion polls have reflected what you just said as well. And I have one last question for you because I'm going to have to leave early. I'm very tired today. Well, first off, I wanted to say you mentioned the sanction, which is great because there needs to be more, including in academia, focus on that. I do cover a lot the sanctions. For example, the UN determined in 2020, of course, figures are higher today, that in Venezuela alone, there was 100,000 civilians killed by our sanctions. But my last question to you, do you think that the UN Security Council should be abolished? And if so, why?
So, and earlier today, I mentioned the third world and what it was a project of unity to form this whole new order. Personally, I think that any institutions that sets itself up as a hierarchy of states where some states have more power and control over others should be abolished or dismantled. The United Nations, if they are to say that all states are sovereign and equal, one state, one vote should be the norm. And if it isn't, then it is just the institution that facilitates and entrenches the status quo of Western capitalist imperialism. And so in that vein, I would say abolish the Security Council. If you want to say the UN needs to be, reestablished or started over so that, a better vision of equality between people in the world could be had, then that's what needs to happen. But as it stands right now, I don't think that there is any global international organization that has as its mandate liberty, equality, and justice in the world. They're all hierarchically ran. And as long as they remain that way, then we'll continue to infinity to have these types of conversations.
Absolutely. I think there's good and bad about the UN, but I agree with you, and I'm sure Chris does as well, that if they abolish the Security Council, they can get a lot done. The bigger powers can still coerce smaller powers, but without being able to veto all those resolutions, I think it would give the people of the world a bigger voice.
Well, I tend to think that we need a UN that isn't built on colonial institutions and colonial ideas. And the real problem with both the original League of Nations and the current United Nations is that control is weighted towards the global north, specifically the western part of the global north as we see it in the way we carve up the globe. And as long as the Anglosphere and Western Europe have that weight in their direction, I don't think the UN can ever be democratic.
And the U.S. abuses the veto more than any other nation. There's been other nations that have abused it as well, but the U.S. abuses it all the time, every year over Israel, Palestine. I mean, it's just the veto powers. I think it's ridiculous. It's undemocratic. But thanks for coming on, Dr. John. Continue to converse with Chris, and maybe our listeners have comments or questions, but I'm going to have to head out a little bit early this time.
Have a good night, Alex.
Yes, have a good night.
Thank you.
And if there are questions, I would be happy to. I don't even know where I would see the questions, but
they would be over here on the right. The comments can go on the screen like this. But this is actually. This actually makes sense because gentrification is stealing all that wealth back from the people who built it in much the same way that we seem to steal everything back every 20 years from the people who have earned it, whether it's 2008 or 2020.
Mm-hmm. Do I have to go on the YouTube to see comments? Oops.
Yeah, the YouTube. The comments are in the YouTube are in the YouTube chat.
Let me see. Sorry to the people who are there. I'm trying to pull it up. And I'll put my phone like this. I still don't honestly know how to view any of these things, so I'll just wait until they come up on the screen.
But yeah, control is what I've really been trying to sort of study lately, whether it's in foreign relations or whether it's domestic or whether it's business. There's a lot that needs to be parsed sometimes to know who's really benefiting and who's really calling the shots, I think. It doesn't always seem to be even the people in office. And I think it's really a good proof of some of the arguments people have made about the capitalist class in the past and how a liberal system of democracy can't really break away from that.
I agree. I also see a comment by, and sorry if I say your name wrong, Zainab Day. And it asks, as individuals in our communities with limited resources to change the global zeitgeist, how does Tamanisha suggest we fight imperialism as individuals? And so one, all struggles for power or control is precisely that. It is a struggle. And if we conceptualize it as a struggle, then we can't view the struggle itself as an individual event or an individual phenomenon. So as individuals, the most that someone like you or I could do on our own is obviously to educate or talk to people about things like imperialism and how it's connected to our everyday lives. But if we are to actually try to change sort of the situation of imperialism, it has to be something that we do in struggle and in community with other people. And that is why my gentrification example, for instance, I said, had my community known that the moving of the factory and the bringing in of this convenience store meant that we'd be displaced 2-3 years down the line, then we could have done something about it, right? So all struggles they have to be collective. And so I think it's very important to form community bonds or have a community wherever you are. Someone like me, I've been in school for the majority of my adult life. And, whether I'm in New York or Wisconsin or Miami, and even now in Georgia, the first thing that I always try to do is root myself in community, know the people who live around me, know the people who attend and do things that I like to do, because I know that if I form those relationships, get to talk to them and get them on board, share my philosophy, listen to them and their philosophy, then we can do things together. Like I currently live in a building where we have no stop signs and no stoplights. And the first thing that I did within 2-3 months of moving here is, hey, we should petition to get these stoplights and things put in. And so that's currently being done. But don't just sit down and, wait for things to happen, but you actually need to get up, talk to people, figure out how you can improve where you are. And it is through engaging people in, helping you all collectively realize that you can change something, that I think that you can bring about broader forms of change. And that's why, I don't know if you follow me on Twitter or see any of my social media, I'm constantly bemoaning the fact that you have this broader mist of anti-intellectualism and historical revisionism and this sort of individualistic ethos and ethic that haunts US society more or less, because then it becomes much harder for people to try to view themselves and their struggles as a collective.
And this is a great example because this is Woodrow Wilson's era. I think we can learn a lot from the battle on Blair Mountain and the organizing that led to the Coal Wars in Kentucky and West Virginia. That wasn't that long ago. There were parts of this country that had that sense of community once. In a European sense, the battle on Blair Mountain was like last week, as opposed to as long ago as we feel like it. In America, anything 50, 60 years old, that was so long ago. That's near 110 years now, getting close. But that's nothing compared to history in other parts of the world. That's nothing compared to the history of the people who lived in America before Americans got here. Mm-hmm. It's this whole sense of how we view the world has been changed in a relatively short time by American media.
Yeah.
And
I also think by this belief amongst people more broadly that any sort of change is necessarily positive, and that as time moves forward, it necessarily means that progress will happen or has happened.
And there's you see a lot of illusion of that, I think, in the way people sell progress or development in the global South. We talk about great examples of development as things that benefit us somehow and not necessarily the people in those countries.
Yeah. I'll give an example. Guyana obviously just found oil. All of it is being mined by foreign corporations, so not Guyanese corporations. A lot of them don't have insurance. So if there's an oil spill, it'll be covered by the Guyanese taxpayer. And right now we're getting all of this messaging of prosperity to come and prosperity coming. But at the same time, no one is talking about the inflation, the displacement that is already happening, just that the people who are being brought into work on the oil are coming in. Like $1 when I was there this summer was like 210 Guyanese dollars. And prior to COVID, so the Guyanese dollar was never, super, super strong, but that was an insane amount.
That's serious hyperinflation. And that's what happens when you have more money than you have stuff to buy with the money. That's actual hyperinflation that we never see in the United States, because unless there's actually pressure on a supply chain, we are above scarcity, unless you live in the wrong neighborhood, of course. Which is another example of control. Who has plenty and who is denied anything. Who has the power to stop people from dumping their trash in their neighborhood or their toxic waste, or the.
I will make one comment, and then I'll hop off of this call to go to sleep. It has, so it's not about like states or anything, but the other day, the Joe Biden administration, they said that they would, forgive $10K in loans for people with Pell Grants, and they can give $20K. And you had this big push, and I saw liberals doing it, and also conservatives in the U.S. doing it, of why people should pay off their debts, right? And I found that so laughable, precisely because, in a lot of poorer countries who have these immense debts, sometimes the payments on these debts overshadow them paying for things like education and healthcare in their country, especially in the Caribbean. But a lot of those countries also don't default. And it's because we've created a system where debtors within the system must pay back. Now, of course, it's always been the case that depending on who you are as a debtor, then you don't have to pay back. And again, about these logics coming back home that are not tied to the military, right? States cannot default or, claim that they can't pay off these loans. And now you have it where a common consensus that goes against common sense of regular people who are just thinking about it on a minuscule level are saying, no, our loan should be forgiven because we had to take it out because we couldn't afford to go to college otherwise. Yes. This is the exact same scenario for states that experience balance of payment problems or economic crises where they are in desperate need of capital. And if you make those kinds of connections, then I think that more people would support, some of these debtor states being forgiven in their debt. But people are making these connections. And so,
they absolutely would. And historically, debt is one of the biggest weapons that the ruling class uses to remain the ruling class. Back in the really, really olden days, during the Roman Republic, a series of political crises revolved around the fact that the common people of Rome owed too much money to the rich people of Rome. And consistently, because the government was composed of the rich people of Rome, they chose to side with the people who were owed instead of the people who owed. And eventually it led to political breakdown and the loss of their republic to what they saw as a tyrannical monarchy, and which the ordinary people saw as freedom from oligarchy early on. There are all sorts of statues to Augustus as having restored the republic and overthrown the oligarchy, as if he wasn't emperor. And while some of that is just propaganda, there's the fact that he was the first person to give people any sort of relief from debt meant they remembered him better than the supposed republic.
Mm-hmm.
And someone will use that debt against the system eventually in the same way if we don't just forgive it, because it will become an increasingly festering political issue, and there will be more and more civil unrest as people realize they can't ever pay what they owe.
Yeah. But I also think that it's important for people to get into anti-capitalist organizing again.
I agree.
As well, because I think we should not just assume that people will be squeezed to the point of X, Y, Z, that then they would revolt. Hold on, and I do want to
be organized when it happens. Whether it's going to happen or not, we need to be organized for it, or it won't happen, or we won't be ready for it.
It won't happen, or we won't be ready for it. So again, I think it's very flexible. Something that is a new phenomenon that I think that people take for granted is the fact that now you have it where, let's say you or I want to purchase something, but we can't. We don't have enough money to afford it. Typically, you would take out a credit card that came with a high interest rate, and it gave you a certain amount of money that you could spend on it to buy whatever you needed.
Yeah.
That's obviously becoming unsustainable as more and more people not just take on debt, but have bigger amounts of debt.
Yeah.
So now you have these companies that are setting up that do interest-free charging, where you can enter a payment plan on basically everything. You can enter a payment plan to get a $5 thing of makeup, 0 interest.
We've reinvented direct credit.
Exactly. And so when you do things like that, it makes things a bit more tolerable.
Yes.
And what you know is that as long as things become a bit more tolerable, people are less likely to be frustrated to the point that they want to go out and do something about it. And when we talk about the issue of debt, I honestly think that Cuba stands out as a great example. So as you know, Cuba, unlike a lot of other Caribbean countries, cannot borrow money from the IMF given U.S. sanctions.
Yeah.
A lot of people were upset the other day because you had the oil tanks that caught fire in Cuba, and they were saying, oh, the U.S. isn't giving any monetary aid, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the U.S. whole intent on sanctioning Cuba is obviously to commit economic violence. It doesn't care that people are dying due to sanctions. It doesn't care that sanctions are genocidal. It doesn't care about any of the data. But what the sanctions does is that it increases Cuba's external debt to private entities. And, you know, if Cuba cannot pay back those private entities at the same time, unlike a lot of other Caribbean countries that, you know, would be in bad standing or whatever, this hasn't happened yet for Cuba. You have some private creditors that could forgive the debt or wait out the debt or for the debt to be repaid. But what it really does is it makes it hard for Cuba to borrow. And yet, even though that is the case, and I don't want to sensationalize it, because in Cuba it is harder to get money. Inflation, just like inflation is, you know, high in Guyana, it's undoubtedly higher in Cuba as well, given COVID. And also the fact that it has less ability to access outside capital.
Yeah.
But I think that their debt resiliency to being forced to pay back debts at, you know, whatever time is a shining example, because then they just focus what capital they do get on providing services for people. And I think that if other Caribbean countries did that, they'd be much better off than where they are right now, because then you have happier populations that could do more things with their time, their lives, etc., and not just be destitute, awaiting IMF.
And Cuba, despite all of its very real problems, Cuba has a longer life expectancy, better medical outcomes, and a higher literacy rate than the United States. And a lot of that is simply because not as many people get left out of their system as get left out of ours.
And they're not forced to incentivize spending in some areas over the other. Like,
Exactly.
of course, now you have a lot of people who are saying, oh, Cuba needs to privatize, it needs to deregulate, it needs to open its economy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the reason that it's able to have such a high standard of human living and humanness within its economy is precisely because it's not being told by creditors what to prioritize. And of course, you get some of that sometimes, but it's not beholden to these sort of strict conditionalities that other countries are once they're accepted into the.
It sounds bad not to be able to get an IMF loan, but IMF loans did not end up being good for Greece or Brazil.
Yeah, because of the conditionalities.
Everything, Brazil in the 80s, when I was a kid, we heard about how great the public utilities in Brazil were. And then in the 1990s, they needed an IMF loan. And this whole public utility system that was the envy of the world was completely privatized to for-profit companies that mostly weren't even Brazilian. And it's just literally looting the country as terms and conditions for giving them a loan that they're still going to have to pay back anyway. And it's just, I mean, I understand why people think they need that money, but
well, in this respect, I would say that the internal contradictions also matter. Yeah. So while we talk about the people, what we're really talking about is the leaders of the country. Yes, right? If they sign these deals, they'll feel it the least, is what I say, and they'll also be paying back the least. It's the people who will be paying back the most and who will feel it the most. And as long as you have some people that are profiting because the class system still exists within poorer countries as well, then we'll continue to see those deals being made. And the reason Cuba stands out as an example is precisely because you don't see this same sort of wholesaling out of the economy for the exploitation of the mass majority of people to the benefit of a few, even though they like to paint it as, this boogeyman communist party.
You said you wanted to go to bed, so I'm going to wrap us up. And my last thought for the night is just that once upon a time, the United States was considered the second most promising country in the Western Hemisphere after Brazil. And now the United States runs the world, and Brazil is another country in the global South. And so my thought, my sort of homework for everyone is, how did that happen exactly? Obviously, the U.S. benefited from it, but how did that happen? And it comes back to control and money. And do you have any final thoughts? And then I'll wrap us up.
Well, my final thought would be, in order to answer the question posed by yourself, they'd have to investigate history.
Yes.
Important.
It is. History matters. And a big part of any sort of relations, international or internal, is material relations and how people get stuff. And with that in mind, Tamanisha, thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Everybody else, thank you for watching, and I hope everybody has a great night.
Good night.